Okay, so this week, Nvidia released DLSS 4.5 Dynamic Multi-Frame Generation. This is a feature that we've been intrigued by for some time because, there is a train of thought that suggests that the end point is going to be for graphics and it's going to be sort of like you ask your GPU what frame rate you want. It typically matches the refresh rate of your monitor, and everything in kind of like terms of frame generation and maybe even super resolution, dynamic resolution scaling is sort of taken care of for you, with a view to sort of minimizing latency and maximizing frame rate and balancing image quality, I guess. So this is NVIDIA's first stab at it, and I think it's best described as, how can I describe it? A sort of advanced beta, I think. I basically tried it just for an afternoon because we've been super, super busy. And I started with Cyberpunk, because I know the game. And I used a Ryzen 7 9850X 3D system with an RTX 5090 to begin with. But don't worry, I'd have tested a much lower GPU in a bit. Started at 240 frames per second. And there's a bit of a problem here because you can't. The typical way you use G-Sync, or the way we use it, is basically to enforce V-Sync at the driver level, and then that basically caps the frame rate, so the frame rate won't exceed the refresh rate of your monitor. And that basically ensures that you get the benefits of G-Sync, and it doesn't tear, and you get the benefits of frame generation. The problem here is that V-Sync is no longer supported, and if you actually enforce V-Sync at the driver level, as is the usual sort of thing that we do, what generally tends to happen when you update to this is that you get like super, super high latencies, and the frame generation factor is locked to 6x. It's really not good. You have to turn off V-Sync at the control panel level. And the problem is that I dialed in 240 frames per second as the limit to match my sort of 4K QD OLED monitor, and it goes above that. The frame rate will go above that, which means that the frame times are sort of lower than the refresh rate, which basically means you get tearing, which isn't really what I want from a G-Sync experience. So yeah, that's okay. I mean, it works. You do get okay latency. It was kind of like in the 50 millisecond range, even when I was going up to like 5x. To begin with, I was on DLSS balance mode, 4K RT overdrive, and it turns out the 5090 is just too powerful. It was like I had to actually introduce DLSS 4 quality level to force the frame rate lower, to make dynamic dynamic frame generation kick in. And it works. The latency is kind of acceptable. If you look at the frame time graph there, you'll see it's not sort of super, super smooth, but then you look at the resolution there, it's, the actual range there is very, very tight. So I think, those little spikes there, they won't be exceeding 5 milliseconds. It's quite hard to pick up on a kind of choppy appearance. Looks okay, but it is exceeding the frame rate of your monitor, therefore you get tearing. So the next order of business is basically to move the frame rate limit down to, I think I did 220 frames per second. So when there is overshoot, in theory, you're still going to be within the range of the monitor, and that is the way to do it. But it's counterintuitive, right? Because you're being asked to put in a frame rate cap, and the cap isn't being respected, which is a fundamental problem with this that kind of shouldn't have made it into a shipping product, in my opinion. Kind of weird, not great, but you can sort of make the frame rate lower. The difference in frame time terms between 220 and 240 frames per second is such that you probably won't really notice the difference. There are still spikes above 240 though. They're rarer, but they're there. So the tearing doesn't go away. Alex, it's interesting. It does work. It is dynamic frame, multi-frame generation. It does switch. We'll talk about the granularity of the switching shortly. But I think from my perspective, I'm a bit disappointed because the whole idea of this was a fire and forget solution, and that's not what we're getting here.
Yeah, typically, so dynamic res for example, which I think is what this should be maybe be modeled on, is like trying to adhere so much so to a frame time that you drop the resolution. And here it would be trying to adhere so much so to a frame time that you increase the frame time multiplier. And I think, yeah, we'll talk about the granularity in a second, but I think the whole deal of that is to unencumber the user from performance drops and or setting changes, which is kind of what I feel like this is also targeting. Like, I don't want to go into the options and put down from DLSS quality mode to performance mode to maintain a consistent, like, let's say 230 FPS in any given cutscene. So I'm going to use DLSS FG dynamic, right? And here, since it is, overshooting and not respecting the cap, among other things, I feel like it does betray the whole point. And it seems more like a technical exercise or, like you said, a beta product at that point. There are areas where I could see this improving. First of all, using VSync and like normal G-Sync does would be a great start. I'm a little bit curious that it wasn't in the first version of this product. And I imagine as we get to the granularity part, there's also probably improvements that could be brought about there. I also think maybe Nvidia should perhaps examine the style of multi-frame FG, dynamic multi-frame FG that is done in lossless scaling, which Rich, I believe, got a quote back in the day about how it works, which is rather fascinating. It works different than this does here, but maybe also produces experiences which are also tangibly, maybe better, good, but at least something comparable.
Yeah, I think the issue, the lossless scaling thing, every frame is generated essentially, which is quite an interesting technique. It does work in terms of respecting the frame rate limits. The issue is that the lag is very, very poor, in my opinion.
Right.
But maybe Nvidia has better options available there. Essentially, they've got this massive team producing products like this, and it's not just some dude like the lossless scaling guy. Before we move on, there is another element to this particular release, which is quite interesting. You've got a new DLSS preset B, and this seems to be a new machine learning model for the frame generation itself, but it's actually taking into account the UI elements. So it seems to be the case that where games actually can supply DLSS with a different plane that is just the UI element, they can now interpret that lane, that plane rather. So you get much better UI element, much better scaling or frame generation on UI elements. That's good news, right? That's pretty cool. Next, I moved on though. I looked at the RTX 5070 because there is the sense whenever these new features come along, you whack out the 5090 and it's like, okay, yes, this is how it works in its optimum sort of configuration. But I kind of, over the months, have kind of grown to quite like the 5070. In fact, it's the GPU that I use kind of most often. I think because when you want to understand how a game works, when you're using the 5090, you've got so much raw power there that you never really come up against too many problems. When you've got the 5070, it's like, well, you've got a firm limit on system resources there. Typically, I like to use 1440p with the 5070. RT Overdrive, you can run this DLSS balanced 1440p, and it's pretty good. I started at 220 frames per second, and it's fine. Latency's a bit higher than the 5090 experience on DLSS quality at 4K. It's kind of like a bit weird. When I look at PCL and it's in the sort of 60 millisecond area, it's fine, but you can tell it isn't quite right. But weirdly, the threshold for me seems to be like 50 milliseconds, where I'm kind of okay with it, even with a mouse. But I started on 220 frames per second, and it kind of works. You are still running at the, I think it is the max DLSS multiplier level there, though, for the most part. Yeah, dynamic 6x. I'm just looking at the at the Nvidia app readout at the top there. I then moved to 144 frames per second cap with two reasons in mind. Number one, there are 144 hertz for 1440p monitors out there, and secondly, there's a lot of 165 hertz 1440p monitors out there. So you've kind of got to reduce the frame rate cap in order to stick within the G-Sync window there, the VRR window. And yeah, obviously the dynamic multiplication factor drops on average. It tends to work out okay. I think it is scalable. You do get a pretty good experience. I am only using one game, and some people have reported problems with Cyberpunk. I didn't have a huge amount of issues here. But what I did was what you could call the waggle test, which is this clip here. And basically, in this area of the black market in the Phantom Liberty, you can basically go outside, you can look at the sky, and then you can look back towards the black market. So you get like very, very low GPU utilization relatively by looking at the sky, and much higher when you actually look at something. And basically, this was of real interest to me because we wanted to figure out how adaptable the dynamic multi-frame generation factors are, because you would expect them to drop when you look at the sky, and you'd expect them to rise when you're looking at the black market. And that kind of is the case here. But you can see from the frame time graph here that it's not great. It stutters. I wouldn't say it is kind of stuttering. There's a lot of variation there on the frame time graph. I also used NVIDIA FrameView, to actually get an idea of how quickly the multiplication factors can change, because obviously that's what you want. You want a very responsive change to the multiplication factors. And the new FrameView basically logs every frame with the multiplication factor as well, which is very, very interesting. And I basically scanned through the FrameView capture and got the top 20 lowest persistence frame generation multipliers. And it looks like the lowest persistence was about 156 milliseconds. That's the time taken between moving between multiplication factors. 156 milliseconds, 180, 227, 248. Those are all ranked. I did the top 20, and the 20th was like 11,000 milliseconds. No. So I think that's basically when we were in an area. Well, I'm not sure that's possible. Maybe it was when I stopped and the viewport was solid. But it can't. The nature of multi-frame generation is that you can't expect a per frame change to the multiplication factor, because obviously there's multiple frames being generated from one real frame. Alex, what do you make of these results? I mean, it's 156 milliseconds at best in this kind of stress test. Isn't amazing, but okay, I guess.
I mean, I don't like that, but I can say it's okay for a first preview version of the technology, maybe. And maybe we are coming, like you just described, maybe we're also approaching limits about what can be reasonably done when the fact that you have to complete the most recent sequence of interstitial frames, like you can't change the multiplier in the middle of the presentation of the interstitial frames of previously rendered stuff. So you're going to have overshoots as a result of that, especially with wild camera movement, rapid camera movement, where the load changes quickly and the interstitial frames are actually covering a large gap of space. And I think you're going to see overshoot. You can also see in certain games with DRS an intense overshoot. So what you end up doing there is you starve the GPU even more to prevent overshoot. You essentially increase the gap because there's a limited amount of granularity to get in the changing. Technically, you could do that too here, I guess, with DLSS FG, as in make the GPU less utilized to, compensate a bit more for overshooting. Right. But then you'd start impacting overall frame rate uptick from using FG as well as using MFG, and also the effectivity of dynamic FG at that point, because you'd be seeing in general potentially less need to do the dynamic portion. So perhaps we are coming upon just like limits there. And but in general, like you mentioned, I think this could be improved still beyond the first case. We'll also be talking about another technology here that NVIDIA brought out with this series of drivers. And, maybe this is just the first step. The original version of FG also could have seen improvement. We talked about frame pacing issues with the original version, as well as with quality issues that have improved over time. So perhaps this is another base area where that'll be improved over time, right? So.
Yeah, just to be clear, the reason why you want dynamic frame generation in the first place is that, if you lock to a specific level, then there's going to be scenarios where you don't need to lock to that specific level,
right.
to achieve a certain frame rate. And therefore, you're paying the price in terms of extra latency and even potentially reduced image quality. So the idea of having a dynamic level of frame generation is actually really, really cool because, if you don't need to be at 4x or 6x as it is now, you can go to a much lower factor and get a more responsive experience. It is quite interesting, though, from my perspective, that the actual delta in terms of PCL within these tests is relatively small. 10 milliseconds or so, maybe. Between the various factors, but it is a thing worth having, I think. John, you do use frame generation, but your monitor's 120 hertz when you typically do PC gaming?
No, I use a 165 usually, or 330, or 330 depending on the res.
So this would have benefit to you then?
Oh yeah, absolutely. If it works as it should, it would have a lot of benefit. Because right now, obviously, I pretty much can only use like 2x frame gen when I'm in 165 mode. If you go more than that, then it's it tends to be a bit much, but because it reduces your base frame rate too far. 330 though is especially useful. I don't know, man. I really do like frame generation, and every time I show it to somebody running properly, they're always surprised because it does look like just a native high frame rate. I really think it's awesome, but it's, you just got to set it up correctly.
Yeah, I think it's worth giving this a go and seeing how you get on with it. Just be a bit wary of the actual frame rate cap variable that you need to put in there. So yeah, I think generally this is okay. I think it was quite an interesting technology. It wasn't just the finished article I was hoping for, though. I think there's still a lot of work to do with it.
Did you try, by the way, Rich, did you try V-syncing this?
I did, because what actually happened was I booted up my PC, and because that is the default for me, right, to actually have G-Sync with V-Sync active,
as it should be.
I just loaded up Cyberpunk, and it was like, latency was sort of 300 milliseconds, and I was locked to dynamic 6x. Which basically wasn't dynamic. It was locked to 6x, and it was kind of like, okay, something's got a bit wrong here. And it was actually quite interesting because with Cyberpunk, you sort of I was scanning about with the mouse to sort of get an idea of how it looked, and it was kind of like fits and starts. It was completely broken. I kind of think that maybe there should have been some guardrails in there. I think maybe rather than just reading about it in a reviewer's guide or on the website, I think there should have been maybe something within the Nvidia app saying, whoa, hold on a minute, maybe you shouldn't be doing this. Because that was my first experience. It's only because I'd read online and then I checked the reviewer's guide that V-Sync doesn't work with it that I turned it off and things were okay again. There was another experience I had that was a bit weird, where I had the 5070 in and I adjusted some of the settings, and it switched itself back to 4K, and the things went horribly, horribly wrong there.
Oh, yeah.
That wasn't great. And I was wondering, okay, what's going on here? Has VSync been turned on again? And I had to go back in and I looked that the resolution had been changed back to 4K, which from the 5090 testing, which wasn't ideal. But I do think there's potential here, and I think it's kind of like what you want for frame generation. I think that the final end game for this, though, isn't just dynamic multi-frame generation, but also dynamic resolution scaling as well, and maybe a mixture of the two. Maybe sliders where, I don't know if that's really the route forward, sliders where you choose where you want the bias to be, whether in dynamic resolution scaling or frame generation. I guess the issue there, Alex, would be that what you could achieve in terms of increased frame rates with dynamic resolution is probably far less than dynamic frame generation.
Yes, I think you arguably would start reaching that phase. But it's interesting. I think this technology at least proves that it's doable now also, because apparently the driver has some sense of what your current millisecond present time is. And in the past, I think they would have maybe said there's not enough granularity to even attempt such a thing. That's why a lot of developers they haven't shipped dynamic resolution on PC. And you've seen engines like Unreal Engine 5 only until recently having it being commented out in the normal distributed build through the Epic Games launcher. And then, I think they added it in maybe 5.6 or 5.7. I can't remember. But so I think this proves that even a driver could start doing dynamic resolution from the DLSS perspective. And I almost say, why not? Give it a try. I think that would be a cool extension of this technology. And like Rich's suggestion of being able to bias which one affects the image more. I think there would probably be a hierarchy of needs though. Like you say, like you'd first start with frame gen. And then as things get like under a certain millisecond threshold, like the bottom line there, you'd start doing resolution. Which would be maybe pretty awesome.